All right, so thank you for joining us this evening. So this is our Plant Watering 101 webinar. This, I think, is a great start, and it's especially pertinent now as we are dealing with things like in some counties in Indiana, we're dealing with very close to drought effects across a lot of areas. We may have had different storms and other things that may have affected our landscape. And you may just have some general questions about best management practices. And a lot of those things come down to how do we water our plants? Now, a lot of the things that I learned researching this were new to me too. So I found this really fascinating. And I'm also going to share some of my own personal experience as I and my wife have been raising different plants and how we learned best to take care of them. So a lot of the problems that come with plant watering really boils down to three very simple things. Either you have watered too much, you have watered too little, or you may have done what I'm going to call a misapplication of water. And I'm going to go into that later. I'm going to save that for a little bit later. Before we dive into the nitty gritty of these topics, what I want to go over first are some of the reasons why we really want to monitor how we do our job of watering our plants. And there are several dangers, unfortunately, involved in this. For the most part, what I'm about to show you really is going to revolve around disease, which is arguably the greatest danger that we deal with. Any of you who have grown tomatoes in the state of Indiana will be well associated with these issues. So let's look at a few different things here. So some of the dangers of overwatering, now I'm talking about using too much water here, is that you can have water sitting on leaves and other surfaces that are going to offer the chance for disease development. Most of the diseases that we handle as gardeners are probably going to be a fungal or a fungal-like disease. There are a few bacterial diseases and there are a few viruses, but really fungi are going to be what it boils down to. If you water too much, you can have a really detrimental effect on your root system. You can have root rot develop early in the plant's life. You can also cause a few other problems with different molds and fungi developing within the soil that can affect your root system, or you can influence exactly how it grows, because if roots are getting certain kinds of water at certain levels of the soil, they may not feel the need to grow in different directions. So what's one danger of overwatering? I decided to go through a few of my favorite plants to see what some of the dangerous effects are. One of the ones that I found, because some of you may be aware, I just recently started growing a bunch of roses, my wife and I, is rose black spots. This disease is fairly telltale. You can see it here in this image laid out really nicely. Rose black spot is caused by a fungus called Diplocarpon rosae. It's identified because of the black spotting it leaves, thus the name, but it also can be surrounded by a yellow halo, which is a very common effect in a lot of different fungal diseases. You can find this across many of them that strike many different plants. And unfortunately, rose black spot spreads very easily because of splashing water. And this is going to be the #1 way that you find a lot of fungal diseases can spread, is through the splashing of water when you water from overhead. Another illness that we deal with, and all of you are probably very familiar with this one, especially if you went to any of my tomato programs, is late blight of tomato. This one is perhaps one of the absolutely most common diseases of tomatoes. Now, the thing about late blight of tomato is that it's a little bit interesting in that it is not a native disease to Indiana. Late blight will blow northward from other states on the wind through its spores. It can also be carried in by transplants. Now, this is one of those fungus-like diseases caused by an organism we usually call Phytophthora. Its scientific name is Phytophthora infestans. This disease thrives in cool, wet conditions. So if you've had a year with a lot of rain and your tomatoes got utterly ruined, you probably were dealing with late blight. And unfortunately, we get it every year. It's extremely common to have this disease occur, even though it is not native to our environment. Now, this is one of the things that I love talking about because it comes to insects, and a major insect problem with regards to overwatering are fungus gnats. Fungus gnats do literally what their name says. They will consume different fungi and different plant parts. Now, the reason that they are such a problem is that they usually only occur when you are overwatering. A fungus gnat is a very tiny fly. What they do is they lay their eggs and they develop within just the first few inches of the soil layer. And when they hatch out, they're going to consume roots and other plant matter. Now, normally I don't see fungus gnat infestations so bad that the roots are utterly consumed and the plant dies. But what does happen is that as they damage the roots, they create openings for different diseases to come in and have different effects on the plants themselves. Most of the time, most people's problem that they have with them is simply they are just absolutely annoying. This is an extremely common insect indoors when you have indoor plants. And if you want an example, my wife has recently started working on growing a lot of different succulents. And we weren't very familiar with the care of them. We were kind of learning about it, and we got a fungus gnat development. And what we found out is that we were overwatering those succulents, creating a perfect environment where we had a plant that didn't have strong water uptake. Different succulents really don't absorb water that quickly. They're meant to live in an environment that doesn't get much. So the gnats were coming into the soil that was staying moist for a much longer period of time than non-succulent plants. And those fungus gnats were able to develop and create a perfect environment to survive in. And thus we had the major problem. The great thing though, and I'm going to, just for anyone who wants to know how to get rid of these, if you've ever dealt with fungus gnats, stop watering. Quite literally, that is the answer. Plants only need watered so often. I'll go into that a little bit more later, but if you just stop watering your plants for a little while, the fungus gnats will go away. You'll take away the conditions they need. All right, so along with overwatering, of course, by common sense, there are dangers of underwatering. Now, this one isn't nearly as long-winded as the overwatering part, but there are a few points that I wanted to make here. So the trouble with underwatering is that the effects of underwatering are going to look a whole lot like as though you had added too much water. You're going to see browning leaves. You're going to see the tissue of the plant parts begin to soften and wilt, just like they would be if they had too much or too little watering, vice versa. And eventually it's going to lead to leaf loss and a lack of the plant's ability to photosynthesize to make its own food. Now with overwatering, you are going to see that leaves will begin to yellow more as compared to underwatering plants. So that means that if you are underwatering plants, the leaves will brown and fall off, and that's all there is to write home about. Overwatering means that your leaves are yellowing, more and more nutrients are getting transported into the leaves, but since the leaves are getting so waterlogged, they're not able to work with that material, and the tissues are just going to soften and get ruined. The thing that I like pointing out here is that your soil conditions are going to act as a guide in this situation. And this should go for whether you're worried about too much watering or too little. Use your soil to tell you the story of what's going on with your plant. There are lots of good reasons for this, and I'm going to dive into those right here. So with overwatering, if your soil is moist beyond 1 inch of depth, or your potted plants have standing water in the drip tray, this means that you're going too far and you need to not water. Basically, when it comes to watering, having the soil moist but not sopping is what you're aiming for. And you only want that every so often. If you put your finger into your potted plant or into the soil where you're growing your tomatoes and it stays moist well beyond the 1 inch limit for a longer period of time, that plant has enough water. It doesn't need any more. If your potted plants have standing water, that means that they were not able to absorb what you gave them. And all of that standing water is basically an invitation for disease and a host of other issues to start occurring, like insect infestation, different molds developing on your pots and your drip trays. And you're also increasing the overall humidity within the area of the plant. So again, it's just kind of creating this perfect circle of, even though you may not be splashing water on leaves, with the increased humidity, you're actually making that happen anyways. That water is just hanging in the air and it's going to begin adhering to the plant. Now, when it comes to underwatering, we're looking at the exact opposite situation, of course. There's no noticeable soil moisture. If your soil becomes cracked and hard, it may form a kind of crust. For those of you who are familiar with farming, you're going to be real familiar with the crusting effect of when you've had rains and then a sudden drying period. You'll notice that plotted plants will begin to lose mass. For example, if you have a potted plant and you take the plant and you just pull it out of the pot gently, you're going to find that it and the soil mass are just going to pull right away from the pot with no issue at all. That means that plant has far too little water and it needs to get some help pretty quick. And when you're outside, though, you're looking at a somewhat different story. You can't exactly pull plants out of the ground very easily. Here, you're just sticking to the same thing I have already said. Try to push your finger into the ground to see where the soil is moist. If the ground is so hard you can't push your finger into it, you could have a few different problems, water being one of them, or soil compaction, which ultimately is the fault of watering anyways. So these are things that you're going to want to watch for. Your soil is an invaluable guide to help you understand the water conditions of the plants that you're working on. So keep that in mind. Okay, so I've given you lots of the bad. So what about the good? Where can we get started with trying to solve the different problems that you may be experiencing right now? So there are a few good starting rules that you can work with. The first one, and this one I actually found not only from my personal experience, but I also found it reflected in multiple extension services across the nation. Everyone is saying the exact same thing. Most plants only require 1 to 1.5 inches of water per week. In a normal condition in Indiana, mind you, if you're out of state, I can't quite say, but in Indiana, nature will usually take care of that for you. I mean, we live in Indiana here. We have a saying, if you don't like the weather, wait a few minutes, it will change. And usually that change involves rain and a cold front. So you're probably going to get that throughout most of the months of the year. Now, obviously, right now, that is not the situation. This is the dry period normally. And I'm guessing we're probably going to experience a few more dry periods as we keep advancing through the years. When you do water, and when it is necessary, a deep watering is best, but only once a week. I'm going to repeat that. When you want to water, a deep water is best, but only once a week. You do not need to water every day unless we are experiencing scorching conditions. And I can only think of a few days this summer where we really hit that point. Now, there's a reason for this. And I'm going to go into that, I believe, in just a couple of slides. I was about to dive into it right now, but I saw my third point here. Younger or more recently set plants that you may have just put in are going to need watered just about every other day because they are still adapting to the situation. Younger plants or seeds may use water as a trigger for their development. Recently set plants are going to be highly stressed because of the move. If you've transplanted something, you've got to baby it. It's going to need watered probably every other day, maybe a little less depending on the age of the plant and how resilient it is. So keep that in mind. I did say plants only require 1 to 1.5 inches of water per week. That doesn't apply if they're younger or if they're seedlings or if they're recently set. Okay, so this is one that, this will get a little bit more into some of the things I've been holding off on. This is one that unfortunately I get into a lot of arguments with, and I'm going to try to approach it as carefully as I can. A lot of people, including some master gardeners I know, don't really know how to water appropriately. Really, it comes down to one simple thing. You should never, ever water over a plant. Because what you're doing is that while you are allowing the plant to get some evaporative transpiration on the surface of its leaves to cool it, a plant can generally take care of that effort on its own. It really shouldn't need a whole lot of help unless it's already stressed. If you put water directly on leaves, that means that you've now created an opening for a fungal disease to begin taking root. That is all spores need to be able to develop on the surface of leaves. And as water splashes over those leaves, if there is one of the plants in your garden that has a bacterial infection, that is how that infection will spread. The bacteria will get carried by the water and they will splash onto another plant. This is why you also want to plant different species different feet apart. So that way, if rain occurs, they're not splashing water between each other, there's enough space. But that's a whole other program. You want to have water distributed directly to the soil at the base of the plant. That way you entirely avoid getting water on any surface where a fungal disease could begin to develop. And the other reason is, folks, plants only take in so much water on the parts that are green. Water is taken in through the roots for the most part. There are going to be a few exceptions here and there, but just about everything in your garden really is taking in its water through the roots. That is where the water needs to go. So consider, if you are wanting to redesign your garden, or if you are planting a new one, or you're wanting to build new and different raised beds, think about this when you begin to plan your irrigation lines. If you use like drip irrigation, something like that, you want those lines set below the canopy. You don't want your garden to look like the fresh vegetable aisle in Kroger where it's got the little mist sprayer turning on. That is bad. You want those irrigation lines on the ground so that way the drip fed water is going to go right to the soil. That is where you want it. Now, there are a few things that you're going to want to keep in mind during different conditions as you begin to water. And this is going to affect your watering technique. So here in Indiana, the wettest conditions that we have usually happen during spring and the early summer months. Obviously, this year we've seen plenty of variation in that. We've seen storms at some unusual times, so you're going to have to use a little bit of your best judgment with this. But the reason I bring this up is because you need to be monitoring your soil conditions to properly gauge the needs of your plants. You also want to consider the time of the year too. If we have the wettest conditions in the spring and early summer months, plant things that are going to be durable during that time period. Don't plant like sunflowers at the beginning of March. That is not a good time for plants like that. Those are high prairie plants. Unless they're designed or a cultivar that is intended for planting at that time, they won't do very well. You want to make a plan for everything you're putting in the ground according to the time of year and according to the environmental conditions at that time of year, especially when it comes to water. I cannot tell you the number of times where I've had gardeners ask me why certain things failed because they planted them too early. Now, during drought conditions, now this one is going to be more pertinent to us right now. These drier conditions that we're experiencing right now are going to have a lot of different effects on our plants. Those drier conditions are going to really inhibit the development of root systems. So you're going to need to water more. So I said that 1 to 1.5 inches of water per week. Well, during drought conditions, we need to add to that and we need to increase our frequency. If we stayed at like a light sprinkling, what's going to happen is that root system of a plant is going to develop very shallow, remaining close to the top of the soil surface because that's the best place to get the water. But that means that the plant will no longer be able to grow very well, and it's going to lose its structural stability because the roots are not very deep. You want to maintain that nice deep watering, and you want to keep monitoring your plants. This is where you have to be a little bit forward thinking. And I will be honest, I'm still working on this for myself as a gardener. You need to plan ahead. You need to look at the weather conditions as they develop. You need to look at what the weather is going to be like next week, because right now you're probably experiencing a lot of plants senescing, and you're probably experiencing a lot of plants that are starting to die off even if they're not supposed to die off. And that doesn't necessarily always need to be the case. You just have to plan and you have to adjust your schedule accordingly. And of course, different types of plants are also going to be important for that, just like I pointed out with the wet conditions. Now, the reason I bring up winter conditions here is because it's a little bit similar to what we consider as we get with drier conditions. As we approach winter with a lot of our plants, if we left that root system shallow after drier conditions, that means that as the ground freezes and thaws repeatedly, as it likes to do here in Indiana, Younger plants or recent transplants or plants that are just fairly stressed can get heaved right out of the soil because the ground keeps freezing and thawing. So this is why that deep watering and checking your frequency is going to be important, especially now that we are in effectively D0 conditions, I believe is where we're at here in my county. Now, the other thing that's going to be a major help to you to avoid a lot of these issues is going to be winter mulching. Now, keep in mind, this only applies to winter here. There are a few different winter mulches that are going to help because what they'll do is they're going to preserve the soil moisture for a much longer period of time than if you didn't have them. And you can make use of things that your yard may already have access to without spending a whole lot of money. So one of those things that you can use for winter mulching, a few good choices as it says here, is straw, which a lot of us have fairly easy access to, especially those of us who do any hay baling or have neighbors who do. You can also use chopped leaves. So for those of you who live in Terre Haute, like I do, we live in a tree city. We get all kinds of falling leaves all over our yards. This can be used to help with your mulching efforts. One of the things you want to do here is if you chop them up, it makes a much better mulch than if you just dump them on there wholesale. But what I will say is that I've actually used whole leaves to do my mulching, and it has worked fairly well on my property. And then that's just anecdotal, though. There is no science behind that. Okay, tree bark is another one. This is mulch tree bark, keep in mind. This one you can buy fairly readily in a lot of different garden stores. It's easily accessible. And again, these are things that are going to help preserve that soil moisture and the soil temperature as well. I should have mentioned that earlier. Okay, so I do have a question that just came up here. I did a major garden bed redesign approximately 6 weeks ago and have a large number of new plants. I have been watering them thoroughly every 2 or 3 days, but wonder if I should cut back on that now or should I continue throughout the fall? Most of them appear to be watered sufficiently. I would say most likely you're doing just fine there. We are still pretty dry, even though we did get rain a few days ago. I believe I'm one of the drought reporters for the state of Indiana in this area, and I've been reporting that we're in D0 conditions because yards are staying a little bit brown, plants are suffering for it. So I think that you're doing just fine there. I would just keep an eye on weather, and as the temperature begins to cool, you're definitely going to want to start backing off the watering. But right now, I think you're okay. I would just keep a weather eye on that weather situation and temperature. Okay, so what I was going to get into here are plant choices. Now, I'm going to show you a little bit of a case study here. And I am sorry to say that it involves my own yard. So please don't make fun of me for this. Don't tell the other extension educators how my garden looks. I will never live down the shame. But what I wanted to share with you is that, so several weeks ago, I got a COVID infection and I wasn't able to water my plants very well at all. I could barely get out of bed. I'm better now, thankfully, but unfortunately, my garden didn't do so great. But what I saw made for some really interesting comparisons about plant choices and drought conditions. So what I'm showing you right here are some cherry tomatoes that were growing. Oh, I'm getting a little ahead of myself. So I'll go through this first. So what I say here is the most important step in watering is to first understand the kind of environment you live in. So this one is really interesting to me because I work in 2 different counties and I live in a third one. So I work in Clay and Owen counties, but I live in Vigo County. So Clay County is fairly well named. There is a lot of clay. However, Owen County has a lot of natural springs, so there is a lot of water very, very close to the surface. And then when I compare that to Clay County, in Clay County, there is a lot of sandy soil in Clay County. And my yard Vigo County. Vigo County has a lot of sandy soil, and my yard is definitely no exception there. Most of it is just a lot of sand with only a little bit of loam mixed in. So that means that I have really good drainage on my property. So I have to monitor my watering very carefully. The other thing that I add on here, and I think is actually really interesting because I'm from northern Indiana, we're much further into hardiness zone 5. Whereas down here, we're actually really close to that margin. And depending on who you talk to, we could be over the margin for hardiness zone 6. Right here where we're sitting, we're a little bit warmer. Our seasons shift a little bit earlier, and it really does make a big impact on how our plants develop. This brings me to that third point, that not every plant is going to develop the same throughout the entire state. The tomatoes I grow in Vigo County are not going to look like the tomatoes someone else may grow in Clay or Owen County. There are different things that we're going to be combating because of those different environments. So one of the first things to note here, and this is particularly important to watering, is the amount of sunlight a plant requires doesn't necessarily relate to how it's going to tolerate drought or overly wet conditions. A lot of the plants that we grow, like the tomatoes in the background of this image, are full sun plants. They need at least 6 hours of sunlight every day. But if you caught that first image, you may have noticed my tomatoes didn't do so good when I didn't water them. You also want to consider the overall type of plant. Again, I can link this back to tomatoes. Tomatoes need a little bit of babying depending on what kinds, if you're doing some kind of heirloom, or if they may not necessarily be meant for drought resistance. Whereas if we look at another plant, which I'm going to show you a few in a minute here, some of them are much more drought tolerant than others. Understanding that biology is going to hugely impact your watering practices. And I'm going to show you why. So let's look at these tomatoes here. These are just cherry tomatoes. We planted these, I believe, in May. They developed a little bit slowly because the ground wasn't the best for them. And they got really big and bushy. They were a nice determinate variety, and they started setting fruit. The fruit took a while to develop on them because of soil conditions, and then they just started taking off. We had a lot of really good looking tomatoes coming out of them. We were able to get a few, but then we began to notice some problems, mainly linked to watering practice. They weren't getting as big as I would have liked. The skin on them wasn't developing very well for a lot of them. And then once I got sick and I had to cut back on how much I was able to do, the plants just really kind of fell over. The weeds developed and they started taking over all of the water absorption. And while some of the plants were able to be in different parts that were at different height levels compared to others, so they were getting all the drain from rain events that were happening, other ones just suffered and the plants just went down. I'm ashamed to say those plants still look like that in my backyard right now. I'm actually going to end up removing them just to avoid any potential disease issues in the future that those could develop. Now, keep in mind these tomatoes. They are planted about 10 feet away from the plants I'm about to show you. So one of our other plants that we have is a sage. This is a sage plant that was given to us by a friend, and she got it from an heirloom line of sage plants that was originally grown by George Washington's family on Mount Vernon. So this is a very, very established line, and we were really happy to get it. And you can see if you look, there's a little bit of damage on the plant, but otherwise, it is actually still doing really well in drought conditions. Now, there are some drought-resistant varieties of sage that you can find, and there are some that are not. Now, we didn't know the exact variety of this plant. We didn't know if it'd be drought-resistant or not, and I've got to admit, it is one of the more survivable sage plants that I've ever seen. So keep in mind, this is planted about 10 feet away from those tomatoes, and it is doing much, much better than them. If you look a little bit closer in the background, you can actually see a sweet Annie plant too, or a yarrow, I'm sorry, that's also being grown, that's still doing really, really well under drought conditions. They've hardly gotten any direct watering at all in the last 2 weeks. And then thirdly, this is a rosemary plant. This plant started at about half the size that it is now when we moved it outside earlier this year. We moved it outside in about mid-May, I believe. And this plant has just taken off, and I have never directly watered this plant since. So you can see that these different plants respond very differently to watering. but their environment is essentially the same. They're sitting in the same soil, taken from the same yard, the same content of sand and loam, and this is how they're thriving, or not thriving, as may be the case. This really kind of tells the story that the biology of the plant is really, really important. And a lot of these are very, very common plants that you may grow in your garden. So you can see that there's a massive variation in how they're going to react to underwatering or drought conditions. So you may be asking, Bob, why are you telling us about your failure as a gardener? Don't tell anybody, by the way. The reason I'm saying this is plan out accordingly. Know the plants that you're putting in the ground. Choose your irrigation paths based on those plants. If I were going to put these 3 plants together in a garden, I'm going to focus like my irrigation lines more towards the tomatoes than I will the sage. Set a schedule that's going to be able to work with your time and physical ability. For example, those sages and rosemary you see there, if you may feel that you are not as physically capable of doing more of the watering work, those may be better choices to plant than it would be for other plants like tomatoes and peppers and other things like that. The other thing that I would bring up here too is that you want to make sure you know the cultivar of the plant that you put in the ground. A picture that I should have added into this, and I'm kind of regretting that I didn't, is I also planted a lot of sunflowers this year. And they actually did fairly well up to a point. Unfortunately, I began to realize that while sunflowers, being prairie plants, don't need much watering, the cultivar that I had should have gotten more because it just wasn't the right cultivar to put in the ground to ignore. They needed a little bit more fertilizer and they definitely needed more water. Different tomato plants too may be able to tolerate drought conditions better. On the other hand, there are different sage varieties that will not tolerate being ignored that well. Some of them will just fall over dead if you don't pay attention to them. So know your cultivars. And if you're ever curious, remember to speak to your county extension agent. We can actually help you look up those cultivars and the best ways to help take care of them. All right, so I guess my last slide didn't get saved. I'm sorry. So that is actually the end of what I had there, guys. What I will do is I will make sure to add in what I normally do, which is a link to our Purdue Plant and Pest Diagnostic Lab. They can help you resolve a lot of plant disease issues, at least identify them to help you figure them out. We also usually have a link to our Purdue Ed Store where you can find publications on a variety of different plant problems that you may be facing. Beyond that, you guys do have my contact information, but I'll make sure to include that in the email I'll send you when I send out a link to our recording of this plant, or of this presentation, I'm sorry. All right, so with that, I am going to go ahead and